This proves that there is no essential difference in the treatment of women here, although, by and large, the sacrifice of such a personal value as service elevates the acquisition of a woman over that of a slave in a very different manner than purchasing her for money or substantial money value. It must be emphasized here that what is generally true is that the degradation and humiliation of human value decreases if the purchase prices are very high. For money value in very great sums contains an element of rarity which makes it more individual and less interchangeable and thus more appropriate as an equivalent of personal values. Among the Greeks in the heroic period, a bridegroom's gifts to the bride's father, which do not appear to suggest direct purchasing, were quite common, while the position of women was particularly favorable. But it must be emphasized that these gifts were quite considerable. Although it appears degrading if the essence or the whole of a person is made equivalent to a sum of money, an unusually large sum offered may, as later examples clearly demonstrate, somehow counterbalance this, particularly in view of the social position of the person concerned. We know that Edward II and Edward III gave their friends away as hostages for the repayment of their debts, and in 1340 it was planned to send the Archbishop of Canterbury to Brabant not as a guarantor, but as a pawn for the debts of the king. The size of the respective sums averted the disparagement that would have affected these persons if only a negligible amount of money had been at stake. Division of labor among the sexes, and the dowry. The transition from the principle of marriage by purchase, which was probably prevalent among most peoples at some time, to its opposite, the principle of the dowry, probably evolved when the bridegroom's gifts to the parents were passed on to the bride as a means of providing a certain amount of economic independence. The provision of the woman's dowry by her parents continued to exist and to develop further even after its original basis, the purchase money paid by the suitor, had disappeared. It is not worth while tracing this evolution here, about which we know very little. But it is safe to assume that the general custom of the dowry commences with the emergent money economy. The connections between the two may be as follows. Under primitive conditions, where the purchase of women prevails, the wife is not only a glutton for work, that is also true later on, but also her work is not yet specifically domestic, as is that of the woman in the money economy who has to organize the household consumption of whatever the husband has acquired. The division of labor is not yet sufficiently advanced in such periods. The wife still participates more directly in production and therefore represents a more tangible economic value to her possessor than she does subsequently. This connection has occasionally been confirmed in much more recent times. Whereas Macaulay regarded the performance of agricultural work by women in Scotland as a symptom of the barbaric low position of the female sex, an expert emphasized, in contrast, that it gave them a certain degree of independence and prestige among men. In addition, under primitive circumstances, children possess an immediate economic value for the father, whereas in a more advanced culture they are often an economic burden. The original owner, the father of the clan, has no reason to abandon this value to others without compensation. At this level, not only do women provide their own subsistence, but also the husband may extract her purchase price directly from her work. This situation changes when the economy is no longer based on the family household and consumption is no longer restricted to home production. In this new situation, the household's interests split off in a centrifugal and a centripetal direction. Money makes possible separate production for the market and for the household economy, and this separation initiates a more rigorous division of labor between the sexes. For very obvious reasons, the wife takes over the domestic activities and the husband the activities outside the home, the domestic activities becoming more and more an administration and application of the proceeds from the latter. In so doing, the wife's economic value loses, as it were, its substance and its obviousness, since she now appears to be supported by the work of her husband. Not only do the grounds for asking and obtaining a price for her disappear, but she becomes, at least from a superficial standpoint, a liability which the husband takes over and has to cope with. Thus the basis is laid for the dowry, which will accordingly become more extensive the more the spheres of activity of husband and wife are separated in this way. Among peoples like the Jews, whose men, because of a restless temperament and other reasons, are very mobile, and whose women, as a necessary corollary, are more strictly confined to the home, the dowry as a legal requirement was to be found even before the money economy became fully developed, and before it had time to produce the same result. Only the money economy brings together in the sphere of production the objective technology, the spread and wealth of relationships, and at the same time the one-sidedness of the division of labor, through which the earlier state of indifference between home interests and interests in acquisition becomes split and a specific representative becomes necessary for each of them. Under these circumstances, there can be no doubt about the roles of husband and wife. Similarly, the price for the bride by which the man purchases the productive capacity of the woman is replaced by the dowry, which compensates for his having to support the wife or which is supposed to give her an independence and security side by side with her productive husband. The typical relation between money and prostitution, this close connection between the dowry in the money economy and the whole constitution of married life, be it to secure the husband's or the wife's position, serves to explain the fact that in Greece as well as in Rome the dowry became the distinguishing attribute of the legitimate wife in contrast to the concubine, who had no further claim on the husband, so that both compensation for her as well as security measures for her would be out of place. This leads on to the problem of prostitution, which places the significance of money in the relationship between the sexes in yet another light. Whereas all the gifts of the man for or to the wife, including the dowry and the pretium virginitatis, may take the form of a gift in kind or in money, the price paid for sexual relations outside marriage usually takes the form of money. Only a monetary transaction corresponds to the character of a completely fleeting inconsequential relationship, as is the case with prostitution. The relationship is more completely dissolved and more radically terminated by payment of money than by the gift of a specific object, which always, through its content, its choice and its use, retains an element of the person who has given it. Only money, which does not imply any commitment, and which in principle is always at hand and welcomed, is the appropriate equivalent to the fleetingly intensified and just as fleetingly extinguished sexual appetite that is served by prostitution. Money is never an adequate mediator of personal relationships such as the genuine love relationship, however abruptly it may be broken off, that are intended to be permanent and based on the sincerity of the binding forces. Money best serves, both objectively and symbolically, that purchasable satisfaction which rejects any relationship that continues beyond the momentary sexual impulse, because it is absolutely detached from the person and completely cuts off from the outset any further consequences. In as far as one pays with money, one is completely finished with any object just as fundamentally as when one has paid for satisfaction from a prostitute. Since in prostitution the relationship between the sexes is quite specifically confined to the sexual act, it is reduced to its purely generic content. It consists of what any member of the species can perform and experience. It is a relationship in which the most contrasting personalities are equal and individual differences are eliminated. Thus, the economic counterpart of this kind of relationship is money, which also, transcending all individual distinctions, stands for the species type of economic values, the representation of which is common to all individual values. Conversely, we experience in the nature of money itself something of the essence of prostitution.